Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I would like to introduce you to my daughter Adalynn. This is our little Ada. She is 2 weeks and 1 day old today, and today I thought I would film her birth story for you. Oh, we're waking up for it. Okay. For Ada's birth, you will know if you've watched my pregnancy vlogs, I was hoping for a... Oh no! Oh no, why was that? Hold that thought. And I'm back. It's a couple of days later, and I'm really just getting around to trying to film this again. New mums, you feel me? I'm wearing the same clothing, I just realised. They have been washed. So, coffee. So, Ada's birth story. As you'll know if you watched my pregnancy vlogs the whole way through, I had quite a normal pregnancy up until the last couple of days I was pregnant, and things kind of all turned around at that point, and I needed to have my labour induced due to a hospital policy surrounding the growth rate of Aida, who we didn't know was Aida at that point. We didn't know whether she was a boy or a girl. Basically, what had happened was smooth pregnancy all the way until I was 40 weeks and 1 day pregnant. So I was 1 day overdue and I went to my 40-week midwife appointment, and when measuring my fundal height they realised it was the same measurement as it had been at my last appointment 2 weeks before, and it was only measuring at 37 centimetres, which it should have been around 40 centimetres by this point. And it wasn't. So they sent me for an emergency scan just to check that everything was okay with baby. At the scan the next day they checked her size compared to what they had estimated her full-term size to be at my 20-week scan. And the projections versus what she actually was at 40 weeks was out by more than 25 centiles. And at the hospital I was giving birth at, it was hospital policy due to risk of stillbirth that if there was a drop of more than 25 centiles, you would have to be induced. So straight away, in that moment, my rough plan that I'd had my entire pregnancy, that plan just went straight out the window. Ideally, I had wanted to give birth in the midwife-led birth centre at our hospital, preferably a water birth with low intervention, and I was going to try for no pain relief. But that was just a loose plan. It was just kind of my preferences, and I knew that things may not go that way. And I was lucky that I didn't hold so tightly to that, having to accept that things were not going to be like my birth plan had been at all. I had to be induced at the hospital. I had to stay in hospital for the induction, so there was no labouring at home like I'd hoped. And I had to give birth in the central delivery suites. I also had to be monitored practically the whole time, so that limited my movement. So that was all very different from what I'd had in my head. But yeah, so I had the midwife appointment on Monday, had the emergency scan on Tuesday, and they booked me in for my induction on the Wednesday evening. When they told me I needed to have the induction as well on the Tuesday, straight away I said, well, can I have a stretch and sweep today? So they did that instantly. And I was hoping that that might kickstart labour naturally. It didn't. I had a couple of contractions that night, but nothing in a pattern. They were stronger than any other Braxton Hicks contractions I'd had up until that point, but they never formed a pattern, and they died off after I went to sleep. So it didn't really do anything. However, they said when I had the stretch and sweep that I was 2.5 centimetres dilated already. So I was like, okay, so I might actually go into labour naturally before the induction. There was a little bit of hope there. So got into hospital, got into the ward where I was set to stay until I moved up to the central delivery suites to actually give birth. This was a 4-bed ward, so there was 3 other women in there with me who were also there for induction. And at 10 to 7 p.m. I had the pessary inserted. It's a pessary that is full of the hormones that are meant to help your cervix start dilating, and it's inserted into your cervix, and you wait for that to start working, and they can leave that in for up to 24 hours. So that was inserted at 10 to 7, and straight after that they then put a heart rate monitor on my belly to monitor baby, and that was on there for about an hour and a half. And during that time I was starting to have tightenings, I would say at this point, kind of starting to become semi-regular. When they inserted the pessary as well, I was still 2.5 centimeters dilated as I had been the day before, so that was interesting. And my cervix was apparently, I think it was 2 to 3 centimeters long at this point, so still quite a ways away. So yeah, started having these tightenings whilst the monitor was on, but really it didn't look like anything was going to be happening that night. So just before 9 o'clock, Dan headed home because visiting hours were only until 9 o'clock. He could stay overnight, but he would have to sleep in a chair. We thought, if I'm going to be in labour the next day, it's probably best if he goes home and has a good night's sleep, especially if nothing's going to happen. So he went home, but then at about 11 o'clock, I noticed that these tightenings had been continuing to happen and they were getting closer together. They weren't painful at this point, but I was definitely noticing them more. So I turned on, I had a contraction timer app on my phone. So I'm lying in my hospital bed, trying to get some sleep and timing these contractions between 11 and 12 o'clock. And that entire hour, they were 3 minutes apart for a minute long each. So 3 minutes from the start of each contraction to the start of the next one. And my app kept popping up with the message, go to hospital, go to hospital. And I was like, well, I'm in hospital. So I went and told the midwives at about midnight that I was having these contractions so closely together. And at that point I was walking up and down the hallway outside the wards, because it felt a bit better to be walking rather than just laying down. Like I said, the contractions at this point weren't painful, and I was using my hypnobirthing breathing and getting through them absolutely fine just with that. So, and I was just concentrating on trying to stay relaxed and letting things happen. So after I told the midwives, they popped me back on the bed and strapped me back into the monitor. They monitored me for almost an hour, I think, at that point. And the contractions were still that far apart and they were getting stronger. After monitoring me, they examined me. And they found that despite the contractions being so close together and displaying signs of labour, I was still 2.5 centimeters dilated. I hadn't dilated any further with the pessary, but the contractions were becoming quite intense. So they took the pessary out and they said they were going to go and talk to the doctors and see what the next move would be, because my body was obviously contracting, but I was not dilating. And at I think it was at about 1 a.m, 1:15, they straight away came back after speaking to the doctor and said, because of your situation and your body's starting the process but not quite getting there with the dilation, we're going to send you up to the birth suite next in line and we're going to break your waters. Now, prior to this, obviously I wanted a low intervention birth, but at this point everything had changed, and with me not dilating but contracting, I knew that what they were saying was probably my best option. So at about 1:15, we called Dan back to the hospital. He had about 2 hours sleep at home, and at 3 o'clock I was moved up to the central delivery suites. We were popped in a room with a lovely midwife called Jess, who was with us for the first couple of hours of my labour up there at the delivery suite, and she was absolutely lovely. They broke my waters at 3:45 a.m. and instantly, and I knew this could be the case because I've heard many people say it, but instantly after having my waters artificially broken, my contractions, the intensity of them, and I will start to use the word pain here, it went from 1 to 100. Instantly, like, I'd been breathing through all my contractions up till then, like very zen, very chilled, and then that first contraction after my waters breaking, yeah, it instantly all changed. I won't say yelling, I wasn't yelling, but I was definitely making noise. I was very uncomfortable straight away with them. And I went through contractions for about 15 minutes after my waters were broken, before I realised that I was not going to be getting through them without some sort of pain relief. So I asked what the first thing was that I could try, and they gave me some paracetamol, and they said it will take probably about 20 minutes to work. So we got through that, and I actually went for about an hour with just the paracetamol, and it did nothing. It did nothing for me. So after an hour of being on that, I then asked for the next thing, which was gas and air. And so with the gas and air, it doesn't affect you overall, it just takes the edge off the contractions. You breathe it in from the beginning of the contraction until the end of the contraction. You're not on it between contractions, and it just builds up in your system during the contraction, and then it dies off again straight away afterwards. And it just helps take the edge off. Yeah, so at 5 a.m. I started on the gas and air. At 8:30 a.m. I was examined again. And remember, I'd been at 2.5 centimeters dilated at, what was it, like 1 a.m. And I'd then been having contractions all through. The intensity was pretty high. Yeah, things were a bit intense. So at 8:30 a.m. I was examined again, and they found that I had only dilated another 1.5 centimeters to 4 centimeters dilated. And I was so dismayed. I was really dismayed at that point, because the contractions were intense. I was already on the pain relief, and while it was helping take the edge off, I was very uncomfortable. I was tired. I hadn't eaten since 5:30 the day before. I wasn't allowed to eat at this point because I was on the induction route. So yeah, when they said I was only 4 centimeters dilated, I was very dismayed. They said at that point that they'd give me another 3 hours, or 2.5, 3 hours to let the induction methods that they'd already put me through work further. But if I wasn't significantly more dilated by the time they checked me in 2.5, 3 hours, they were going to have to start the oxytocin drip. And I knew with that as well, as with the breaking of the waters, that it would make my contractions even more intense, and that prospect to me wasn't great at that point because I was already quite uncomfortable. The midwives swapped shifts at this point, so between 8 and 8:30 my original midwife in the central delivery suite, Jess, she went off shift, and I got a new midwife called Amy and a student midwife called Aida, and they were fantastic as well. All three of the midwives that I had in there were so wonderful. Like, I cannot thank them enough. They were absolutely fabulous. So they swapped over at 8:30 when I was told that I had that 2.5, 3 hours to get further progressed, otherwise it was oxytocin drip time. The next 2 hours were really tough. I was so uncomfortable. I was on the bed most of this time in the delivery suite because I had the monitors on my belly, and every time I tried to get up and move around with the wireless monitors, they kept slipping around, they weren't staying on correctly. And also I was having trouble finding a position that was comfortable. I tried leaning over the bed, I tried the birthing ball, I wanted to try going in the shower, but it never happened because the wireless monitors just kept slipping off. Yeah, it just wasn't working well being off the bed, so I ended up having to go back on the bed usually. So I was lying on my side. Lying on my back was unbearable. Like, it was so painful. Every time they had to get me on my back to do an examination, and I would experience a contraction whilst laying in that position ready for an examination. Oh, it was intense. That was when I'd be in the most pain out of the whole thing. That was the most pain. Between the contractions as well, being on the bed had one positive. Between the contractions, I was still using my hypnobirthing and trying to stay quite relaxed. We had the hypnobirthing music going. They had soft lighting in the delivery suite. They had this red light tube thing that was really nice, just made a nice atmosphere, and a mural on the wall of a tree, which was really beautiful. So between my contractions I was just trying to relax, and me and Dan were both kind of almost trying to get some sleep between the contractions, just putting our heads down, just resting our eyes basically. And I was still able to do that between the contractions for quite some time, like probably the entire time, which was amazing. And then it was during the contractions things would get really intense, and then again I'd rest, and then it would be intense again, and then I would rest. And that really helped in conserving my energy, I think. So I really did struggle with the pain over that next stretch, that next 2 hours, and in my mind I was quite disheartened. I really didn't think I was going to significantly progress with my dilation in that 2.5-3 hours they'd given me. And I was thinking, I can't do this. I was actually saying I can't do this, and Dan was there telling me I could and helping me through the contractions. But I was at that point where I was like, I can't keep doing this. And I'd already made up my mind that if they said at that next examination that I hadn't progressed further with the dilation, I was going to ask for either higher pain relief or what else they could do, whether that would be a cesarean or I don't know. One part of my mind was going, they can just keep it in there. You can just go home and we can forget about all this. It's that kind of stuff that goes through your brain when you're in labour and you're in that amount of discomfort. And yeah, I literally just thought at one point, we can just stop this. We can just stop it and I can just go. Luckily Dan was there telling me I could do it and helping me through it. And the midwives were so supportive as well. Apparently I kept apologising every time that I had a tough contraction and would make a lot of noise. Well, a lot of noise in my head. Apparently I wasn't actually making that noise, but in my head I thought I was. And I would apologise to the midwives and they kept telling me to stop apologising. And Dan's actually told me I didn't even swear once, which seems really ridiculous for me because I can certainly have a potty mouth. But apparently I didn't even swear once. The worst I apparently said, and Dan cannot get over this, he laughs every time he remembers it, was during some of the tougher contractions. I was apparently saying, "Oh Jesus, oh Jesus." I'm not religious and I don't know where that came from. Anyway, so the next 2 hours, yeah, that was tough, and I was expecting that at the end of that block that, yeah, things were gonna go even further downhill, basically. I was expecting the disappointment of being told I was only 5 centimeters dilated or something. This is where it gets interesting. So that was between 8:30 and 10:30, but about 10 o'clock in the morning, I was getting a lot of pain in my bum. And I was convinced that I needed to go to the toilet. Absolutely convinced. It was really painful, like super painful. At the end of each contraction, the pressure down there was just, oh, so bad. So I asked if I could go to the toilet, and at 10:30ish, I think it was between 10:30 and 10:40, they said, well, just before you go to the loo, we'll just examine you just to check where you're at. And it turns out that pressure I was feeling, it was Aida's head. Because in that 2 hours between 8:30 and 10:30, I had gone from 4 centimeters dilated to completely dilated. And I was ready to push. And I was so shocked at that. I think we were all shocked at that because I'd progressed so slowly since the night before with my dilation to then go 6 centimeters in 2 hours. I don't know what happened. I don't know what changed. But it just happened. And especially at that point where I was so convinced that I couldn't do it, to then know that I was at the point where it was go time. It was just, yeah. So it was time to push. And with my hypnobirthing, I was really wanting to try the down breathing and just kind of softly, gently breathing her out. So I was trying the breathing down method, and that wasn't working for us. It didn't work for us at all. The contractions spaced out, and the midwives got a bit concerned. Not only did the contractions space out, but on the monitor they could see that Aida's heart rate was dropping. And that was basically because she was ready to come down the birth canal, but I wasn't pushing her down. So she was kind of stuck. So they said to me after an hour of trying the breathing down, they said, look, you've got to try and really push now. So I started using their techniques of really just going for it and pushing super hard. And we tried a couple of different positions as well. I ended up delivering her on my side with my knees kind of out. It was weird. I was pushing in that way for another hour, with the contractions spacing out, they said, we're going to try you pushing harder and that should make the contractions closer together, but if not, we're going to have to go for the drip. So again, there was that kind of, not threat, I don't want to use that word, but there was that potential for the drip still at that point. When I started pushing as well, they said it's best to not have the gas and air because you can focus more on the pushing. So as soon as I started pushing, I stopped on the gas and air. So from this point on, I wasn't having any pain relief. So for the pushing part, that was all raw. Once I started pushing, like going for it, the contractions got closer together and things started happening again, which was great. So we didn't need the drip, and things were progressing. But near the end of that hour where I was pushing, Ada was, again, her heart rate started to drop as well. I think just because she'd been in the birth canal for so long at that point. So they put, at that point the monitors around my belly weren't working quite well because she was so low. So they popped the monitor up into me onto her head, and they were monitoring her like that for the last little bit. And with her heart rate dropping as well, they said if we don't get her out in the next couple of pushes, we might have to do an episiotomy just to help her through. And I didn't like the sound of that either. So I went gung-ho and just pushed her out. At one point, they said her head was there, it was starting to come out, and they let me reach down and touch her head. And we could see at that point that she had hair. We still didn't know she was a she, but we could see she had hair, and feeling her there was a huge motivator as well. And I think in the next contraction, I pushed her head halfway out, down to about her ears, and then she was like that for 2 whole contractions, which was painful because that meant I was in the ring of fire, ladies, you know what I'm talking about with the ring of fire, for 2 whole contractions before her head came completely the whole way out. And then it was in the next contraction following that the rest of her came out, and she was born at 12:45 p.m, so lunchtime, on the 17th of October. And oh my gosh, when she was born, just there was that instant, obviously the relief of the pain being over, but yeah, like, I can't explain, I don't think anyone can really explain that feeling when you see them and you hold them for the first time. It was just, yeah, I'm gonna get emotional. But yeah, after all that hard work, to have her there, have her safe, and yeah, she had a really good APGAR score. She had a score of 9 out of 10 at 1 minute post-birth, which I feel like is quite high for a 1 minute post-birth, maybe a 5 minute post-birth one, but she scored really well. So they held her up. They didn't announce that she was a girl, basically. They held her up, and I was like, what is it? Is it a boy or a girl? And we had it, they showed us, and I was like, in my foggy brain, having just been in labour, I was like, that's a girl, right? Like, that is a girl. Like, I had to check. And it felt so right when they said she was a girl, because the entire pregnancy, both Dan and I had felt like she was a girl. We had absolutely no reason to think that, but for some reason we just always thought that she was. So when they said she was a girl, we were like, yep, that's right. That's right. And luckily we had a girl's name picked out. We didn't have a boy's name picked out. We had a short list of about 3 that we still weren't completely sold on, but we had a girl's name picked out. So Adalynn was born. So we had a cuddle. We had some skin to skin time while we were waiting for the placenta to come out, and I was hoping to birth the placenta naturally without the syntocinon, is it syntocinon shot? But after about 15 minutes, the midwives noticed that I was bleeding quite heavily, and we'd already agreed that if I was bleeding heavily that I'd have the shot so we could get the placenta out faster and reduce my risk of hemorrhaging, basically. I did bleed more than the average according to them, and I got 2nd degree tearing. Fun. So I ended up having the shot and birthed the placenta, and then while I was birthing the placenta, Dan was having skin to skin and they were weighing her, that kind of thing. She was 6 pounds 12 ounces, or just over 3 kilograms. That was funny too, because the day before when I'd had that scan, they had estimated her to be about 7.5 pounds, and she was still even smaller than that. And but she was completely healthy, so all the concerns about her size and her growth, she was completely fine. Absolutely strong, thriving, healthy baby, which I was very pleased about after all the worries of the last couple of days. Then, so after I'd birthed the placenta, they started to stitch me up, and I was going to have Ada back for some more skin to skin and potentially to try and latch. We'd already tried to latch during our first little bit of skin to skin, but it hadn't quite worked. I was going to have her back during that time, but I started to feel really woozy. I think it was a combination of the long labour, the blood loss, and the fact that I hadn't eaten since 5:30 the day before, and it was now like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 1:30. So I didn't trust myself to be holding her while I was feeling like that, because I felt like I was going to pass out or vomit or something. So Dan had a lot of skin to skin and cuddles time at that point while I was being stitched up. Then we got our family time, and yeah, we just enjoyed our time then. We had, I think, about 2 hours after I'd finished birthing the placenta. We got to stay in the delivery suite before we were then transferred to the postnatal ward. It was just really nice. We were just bonding as a little family, and even then when we went to the postnatal ward, me and Dan were just staring at her, like couldn't believe that she was finally here. I think overall with Ada's birth, things obviously didn't go the way I had planned in my mind throughout my pregnancy, but I'm very glad that during my pregnancy I always had it in the back of my mind that things don't always go to plan, and you can't really plan a birth. You can have preferences, but you can't really plan a birth. So while I was disappointed initially that things didn't go how I had hoped in my head, ultimately I know that things went as well as they could have gone, really, in terms of induction route. I still had quite low pain medication. At first I think I felt a little bit disappointed in myself for even having some pain medication, but then I think about it and I'm like, I did an induction labour with heightened contractions from the pessary and the waters breaking, and I did that all with just gas and air and paracetamol once. Like, that actually in my mind is pretty damn good. That's pretty warrior-like to me. I'm pretty proud of that. But at the time, while I was in it, my morale was quite low. I feel like I said, there was a lot of the time in my labour that I was saying, no, I can't do this, and Dan was there telling me I could, luckily. But overall, now looking back at it, I am really proud, actually, of how things went down. Considering the circumstances, yeah, the fact that I still managed to have quite a normal birth, considering the induction, considering the intensity of the contractions because of the induction, and then having still quite low pain relief. I'm quite proud of how things ended up. And the main thing, of course, is that Ada's here, healthy and happy, and so am I. And I'm so grateful to all the midwives at Southmead Hospital, because they were absolutely fabulous. We also thought it was quite funny because, like I said, one of the student midwife that was with us for the birth, the second half of the labour and the birth, her name was Aida, and her full name was Adalynn. And we ended up saying at one point, we're like, we've got to tell her, because otherwise it'll just be really weird if baby comes out and it is a girl, we know we're naming her Adalynn. So that just might be a bit too close to be a bit of a surprise. So we ended up saying to her, look, if baby comes out and it's a girl, we're calling her Aida. And she thought that was really sweet. Obviously it was nothing to do with her, but it was just a really beautiful coincidence. And I think we joked at the time, we were like, oh, maybe it's a sign, maybe it definitely is going to be a girl. And it was. Yeah, so overall, not the birth experience that I thought it was going to be, but I'm fine with it. And I'm actually quite proud of how I pushed through it, despite thinking I couldn't at the time. I mean, how can I not be proud of that? In all honesty, how could you not be proud of any way that you give birth? You're bringing a baby into the world, no matter how it's done, no matter what you use to get through it. Like, childbirth is an intense experience, and hats off to every single person who has experienced it, really, no matter in what form you've done it. I'm in awe of the woman's body, basically. Yeah. I don't think I have anything else to add to that. This is probably going to be a really long video with a lot of rambling that I'm going to have to cut out. Yeah. Anyway, that was Aida's birth story. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Yeah. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.